want to hold people too late. This is a civil-military relations marathon. I realize that we've done today, but as in all marathons, there is a reward at the end. And in this case, it's our pleasure to have former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. I'm just going to do a brief introduction. Admiral Mullen will have some remarks, and then we'll do some back and forth and come into the audience for some discussion. As many of you will know, Admiral Mullen is the 17th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He served in that position for 4 years. For those of you who hung with us all day, you may remember from that video montage we did many of those items and issues that came up. Admiral Mullen was present for, whether it was as CNO or later as chairman, serving for both Presidents Bush and Barack Obama. He is a 1968 graduate of the Naval Academy. I have to imagine that was an interesting time to come out of the Naval Academy for civil-military relations. And since retiring from the Navy, Admiral Mullen has joined the boards of General Motors, Sprint, and the Bloomberg Family Foundation. He also teaches at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School and has maintained a strong and important presence and profile on issues of civil-military relations. So without further ado, if you can join me in a round of applause for Admiral Mullen.
And sometimes this just happens when you handle your own schedule. I ended up this morning at Pete Peterson's annual conference on the debt, which I think is a huge problem for us. I just sat with Michelle Flournoy for an hour at a CARE conference. Sam Nunn's daughter, Michelle Nunn, runs CARE for the last couple of years. And to say they're concerned about the 30% cut in the State Department budget and USAID, et cetera, is an understatement. And the whole idea of that discussion was the interaction of the relationship of state, AID, and all those programs to national security. And then I agreed to do this without looking at my calendar. A couple months ago, Kath asked me to do this, and this is this is very near and dear to my heart, this whole issue, and I've looked at least who was discussing it. I saw him earlier. Sam Neill is here. Sam used to work for me and is probably as knowledgeable in this area as anybody that I know. And I'll just talk a little bit about my own views of this and where it is. I'm not sure I can actually put a stake in the ground to where it was when I became more senior. But it wasn't anything I paid a lot of attention to when I was young. So to see midshipmen here and actually War College students is encouraging, because we don't spend, at least throughout my career, we didn't spend a lot of time on it. From my perspective, it was a given, and in that regard, I didn't have any big problems with it. And Kath said, yes, the 60s were certainly a challenging time to be commissioned. That said, I wasn't paying a lot of attention to civ-mil relations at the time. I was trying to find the bow of my ship and my rack and my watch station and get qualified on the gun line off Vietnam. And the only reason I talk a little bit about that is because people are very anxious about what's going on right now in this country, in the world, et cetera. And part of my perspective is we got through that. Those were really, I'm a 60s kid, 50s, 60s, 70s. Those were really tough times. We got through it as a country. We'll get through this. It won't be easy. It's going to be messy. It is right now. But we are going to get through this, I think. And in the long run, we'll be better for it. When I think about civ-mil, a couple things immediately come to mind. Seminal, in my mind anyway, in recent years. When I was the CNO, which was 05, 06, I'd just come back from a trip with 14 of my counterparts from Argentina. And while I was gone, Time magazine came out with a 2-star general by the name of Baptiste on the cover, and it was The Revolt of the Generals. I'm not sure that was it. I'm not sure that was the title, but essentially that was it. And he and 2 other generals had walked away loudly in disagreement and publicly with the Iraq War. And a reporter stuck a microphone in my face and said, well, what do you think about that? And my reaction was, I just came from a couple countries, Argentina and Chile, in fact, that used to be run by the military and where civ-mil didn't exist. And it wasn't in 1770 or 1870, it was in 1970. And I can tell you, my counterpart in Argentina had just signed a document with Human Rights Organization International accounting for, in accountable fashion, for what the military did in the 70s, which you may have read about, which was drop Argentinian citizens out of their airplanes, P-3 pilots actually, in this case. So the issue was pretty live for me when I got that thrust in, that microphone put in my face. That said, it was pretty easy for me to say, we as a country exist in a democratic institution, or democracy, and civ mil control is absolutely sacred. And I couldn't disagree with Baptiste, and I can't remember who the other two were, more. Our job in the military is to serve at the pleasure, and if we disagree, and we should think about that before we take a job, by the way. Most of us don't. We find ourselves, on a cliff, all of a sudden, moral cliff, integrity cliff, illegal cliff, if you will, and you have to make what's almost an instantaneous decision, and I'll come back to that for the couple jobs that I had. But from my perspective, if we disagree with our boss in that regard, then our only option, from my perspective, is to put your letter in and you walk silently. You don't splash it on the front page. It is the resignation that is the disagreement. It is the resignation that is the voice in a situation like that. So this is 05, pretty tough time, 05, 06 for all of us that were involved in what was a very, very difficult war. I'd only say that I heard Ryan Crocker, and some of you mids may have been there last year, Ryan Crocker, who's multiple-time ambassador to many Middle East countries, who gave a speech to the Brigade of Midshipmen, and basically Ryan was called in by Bush 43, what do you think about going into Iraq? He said no, and I didn't know that until I heard him say this. And then overnight, the president makes a decision, and Ryan's the first one in Iraq trying to make it work. That's our job, foreign service, intelligence, government servant, etc. That's who and the military is certainly a big part of that. To the degree that we start to erode that over time, and some might argue that we have, or it has eroded, we, back to Argentina and Chile, and they're not the only two countries, we start to very badly politicize the United States military. And to the degree that we are politicized or allow ourselves to be politicized or become political, we are undoing the very organization that we love and serve and would and willingly give our life for those that we serve with and for our country. So that was sort of an initial point for me, and then back to thinking this through, I had no idea I was going to become the chairman, and I won't walk you through that, but I had an opportunity both before I became the CNO and particularly when I was chairman to think through what are my limits here. How am I going to, what's the space, and then how am I going to look at what will be a very, very tough situation, I'm sure, that I'll have to deal with, and what are the criteria from which I will then walk and say, I'm not going to be able to do that, or I'm not going to be able to carry out that order. I don't believe in that to the point that I'll resign. So I'd done that calculus before I ever took over as chairman. What I didn't know and didn't understand, and I would argue if you haven't been in this job, you don't either, is the world that I walked into. I get asked by a lot of people, young people, what was it like to be the chairman? Well, it's great. Middle-class kid from Southern California can rise up through the ranks and become the top military officer in the country. It's a great country, isn't it? Yes. Every time you walk in the White House, which is a lot, it turns out, I didn't know that, every time you do that, the hair on the back of your neck ought to go up, and it does. And when it stops going up, you need to say, this is enough, okay? This is pretty special. That said, for a military officer, you're walking into a strange land. This is a place where it's politics 24/7, 365. It's what they do. It's not what the Obama administration did or the Bush administration. It's what they've done forever. And you are the lone person in the room, if you will, representing the military on obviously major national security issues. And you find out you're pretty lonely pretty quickly. And there's no go do this job for a couple of years, we'll train you on what this is going to be like. Doesn't exist. And I tell young people, you want to get ready for for the future and to be able to lead, take the hardest jobs you can take, because those are the crucibles. That's where you learn. And you may fail in one or two of them, or certainly fail at times. That's okay, because we're human. But at the same time, that's how you would get ready for a job like that. We can teach this, and you've had, at least from my perspective, and there are others, Peter Feaver and Elliot Cohen, both who have given this issue an extraordinary amount of thought. I never thought about it until I was in it. I didn't have time. I now teach at Princeton. I've been doing that for 4 years. I'm reading stuff because I have time to read it, and because I'm also teaching it, that I wish I'd read 10 years ago. None of these jobs provide you an opportunity to just go to the shore, sit down, read a book over the weekend, and kind of relax. You are nonstop. So so the question is, how do you get ready? Given there are very clear limits in that regard. And then how do you translate that back to the military and the 4-stars, by the way? I had a lot of them that work for me who are not in my job and who don't get to see what I've seen. That's a real challenge. You do it by example. And I'll give you one specific example, and then we can kind of open it up. I was there, obviously, for the Bush-Obama transition. I knew when I took over as CNO in 2005, I would go through a transition. CNO is normally a 4-year job. So I had actually put a fair amount of thought into how I was going to transition as the head of the Navy for a new president. Obviously, I changed jobs. That was not on my preference card. I didn't ask for it. It was a complete shock, quite frankly, when Bob Gates said the president wanted me to take the job. And there's a lesson there as well. You're around town a fair amount of time, your antenna's up, you think you know what's going on. I had no idea that pace wasn't confirmable. Basically, that's what happened. And so Bob Gates asked me, or the president asked me to do that job. The idea that, so I had actually, as soon as I started as chairman, we're going to have a new president, whoever that's going to be. I start working on transition right away. And so we go through transition, and transitions are always difficult. We're in a difficult one now. I would encourage people not to be too judgmental at this point, because it takes any president the better part of a year to get his team in place and to get people and to kind of get going. This one is incredibly visible. I understand all that, and challenging for lots of reasons. But the transitions are very normal. So we go through right away. President Obama comes in, and President Bush made a decision which I thought was a heroic decision. He could have added 10,000 troops in Afghanistan in December. That's kind of when that was the first a major decision that we teed up for him. He says, got a new president coming in, we'll let him make that. And he did that across the board in the things that I thought, because that decision was going to be very impactful on whoever the new president was going to be. So that was the first decision, and the first decision that President, we rushed at him with that, because we're driven by the fighting season in the spring. It takes a while to move people. I found that out, particularly ground forces. So we go in for 10,000, and President Obama says yes, and then he starts the review. Well, of course, this was learning for me. When you agree to send 10,000 forward with the Army, it's really 17,000, because you've got 7,000 that are in support of those 2+ brigades. So you go back and you sort that out with a new president, and then we review it, and over the course of that year, through December really, we go through this Afghanistan-Pakistan review. Enormously difficult, painful, meeting after meeting after meeting. And a new president, it's a big decision, and I don't begrudge him this at all, because this was a huge decision. We're 60–70% of the way through that, and the story, and Woodward gets McChrystal's assessment, and it splashes on the front page of the Washington Post. And immediately, and so part of this is tendencies, okay? My overall view, is the press here, by the way? Is this all on the record?
It's all on the record.
Okay.
They're here virtually, if not in reality. We are streaming.
My overall view is that from the military, now this is the military side, I think Republicans have a tendency to trust us too much, and Democrats have a tendency to trust us too little. So that's sort of where you start. And that's where we were starting with the Obama administration. That's not critical. That was, I think, a realistic position. And then that splashes, and the numbers are big, and of course, right away, we're basically boxing in the President of the United States. And that was our plan. Fact was, we did box the President of the United States. We started to take away decision space from the President, which was exactly what I didn't want to do. And as we worked our way through, because it just went, needless to say, it was political immediately. And then with that, what happened was, and I came back and I told the rest of the Joint Chiefs this, I said, no matter what happens from now on with President Obama, he is going to be scarred by this, and we are going to be fighting our way through this for the rest of the time he's president. And in fact, I would argue that's true. So despite the strategic intent, and believe me, when you get a new president, those of us in the military, you know this, we just kick over, this is our president, and this is what we're going to do. And we ended up in exactly the wrong place for a lot of reasons that I won't go into. And it had a huge impact on a brand new president who didn't have the experience, didn't have the military background, and he's in the middle of 2 wars, by the way, one of whom he campaigned on ending, and the other one, which was at one point, when he was campaigning, the good war. There isn't such a thing, by the way, but relatively speaking, that's how he saw it and campaigned. And then obviously we've struggled mightily even since that time to figure out Afghanistan. And then I'll just come to one other thing, and it's the politicization piece. Those of you that know me or know of me, I was hard on retired generals and admirals that got on TV and spoke against the policy. Not because they didn't have the right to do it, not because they weren't civilians, but one of the things that's just a fact is too often the American people that are looking at you on CNN or wherever it is, they don't correlate the fact that you're retired. What they do correlate with is Lieutenant Colonel Umpty Squad, and you're an automatic expert in whatever you're talking about, or Admiral whomever you are. And in that regard, there's over time, you can very badly, I think, undermine the organization that you serve. And you do that because you now take very strong policy views that are immediately politicized for one side or the other. So I railed against that when I was chairman. I didn't understand how far out of the barn that horse was. But I mean, it was a long way out, and I got to the point where Anne Rondeau was running into you. I said, I got to go to the majors and lieutenant commanders. I mean, the senior people are, not listening to me, and this is a slippery slope we got on, and Bill Crow, who I love dearly, but when Bill Crow came out and endorsed President Clinton, or then candidate Clinton for president, that was the okay flag. That's not okay. Every right to do it, all of that, because it really put us on a path that we continue on. And I don't have solutions for how to get back in the box, except I hope our young people can pick up on this and recognize how serious it is. And then for years, I've seen, rows of admirals and generals at Democratic or Republican convention, whatever it is. And I think, if that isn't political, I don't know what is. And that message gets sent back to the military or to the American people about the military as well. And I was completely appalled at what Mike Flynn and John Allen, I know them both well, they both work for me, I've known them a long time, what they did at the Democratic convention. And I think they hurt the military very badly when they did that. They do that because they feel so strongly about what they're speaking to. But it's my view, not theirs, it's my view they badly undermine the institutions that they love so much. So there's a lot there that's sort of a stream of consciousness, and I'm happy to discuss.
I welcome the stream of consciousness. There is a lot there. I actually want to, well, I was going one direction until the very end. I'm going to stick with the direction I was going. We may come back to the very last thing you said, but let's go back to the Afghanistan example, but then just broaden it. What do you find has been most successful to you personally, and then in what you've observed in building that trust at the senior level in terms of the relationship with civilian leaders? And what do you think breaks it? What have you seen sort of be a cringeworthy thing you see over and over on either side?
It just takes time. I mean, it really does take time, and you can't, I'm not saying you can't accelerate that. You've got a brand new administration, you know, it's hope and change. The country was ready in this case. And I think this is always the case. You've got a new administration with a big agenda, and they want to go fast. And so the relationships, and Bob Gates, who was, you know, bless his heart, stayed and made our transition, despite our preparation, made our transition much easier because he stayed for President Obama. You have to cement the relationship, and that's tough. And you don't know. I mean, I didn't know. I'd met President Obama when he was a senator a couple times. He called me out about a week after he got elected, and I went out there basically alone to just talk about issues for 3 hours. I think you have to really work the relationships. That's one. And what undoes it probably most rapidly is, and it's what happened to me in that regard, what undoes it is when you just absolutely crush a political requirement that they have, even if you're not thinking that way. I mean, I certainly wasn't thinking about the political requirements aspect of Afghanistan at the time. I wasn't unaware that there were politics involved, but we were working pretty hard to not put him in that position, and when you do that, then it becomes, and it's not, it obviously depends on the president too and how he sees it, but the staff just, you know, and the immediate group around him sort of start building that wall. And then it becomes very tough to establish the relationship, which is absolutely critical.
You have been very outspoken in a good way on resources, and that is something we talked about early in the day, but honestly didn't come up much in the panels. And I'm wondering if you think the issue of sequestration, unpredictability, budget, whatever you want to call it, increasing perception of increasing threat but without the budget to support it, if those dynamics are an important part of the context in which we are seeing civil-military relations currently evolve, or is that a little bit of a red herring, something to be, if you will, to be blamed, and we know our dynamic of civil-military relations ought to be strong enough to withstand sort of the political polarization and inability to come to a budget deal?
I'd say I'd be in the latter camp rather than the former camp. It hasn't, I mean, not that sequestration hasn't been going on for a while, and clearly, you know, I describe sequestration as you know, the very likely outcome of the political polarization that exists in this town, where the extremists from both parties meet on the other side of the world and make a deal. And one group doesn't want to spend any more defense, and another group doesn't want to spend any more money, period, and they make a deal. And so we go into this sequestration, which devastates our services. I mean, we're pretty good, a lot of you know this, we're pretty good at actually planning 2, 3, 4 years out. And when you're existing on CRs since 2012, and you can't plan ahead more than a year, and that doesn't change because of the politics, quite frankly, because those that are in the political jobs can't figure out a way to stand up and make hard decisions with respect to this, then you get something like this. And yes, it saved a lot of money, but it devastated our readiness side. So the money that the Trump administration put in this, I think it's called the skinny budget, was needed money on the readiness side. The money that's there for this budget on the readiness side from all, and I don't have a ton of context, but certainly the ones I've talked to, that it really did have a huge readiness impact. We do need to fix that in the near term. But one of the things that doesn't get talked about much in that I'm really worried about is after war, even though we're still basically fighting I think I saw this morning, we're in 5 countries overseas, by the way. So the wars really aren't over, although politically I understand it's convenient that they are over. We still got a lot of young men and women who are in harm's way, and we need to pay a lot of attention to that. But we do have a tendency after war, a couple of things happen. One is we have a tendency to isolate as a country, and I think you certainly have seen some of that. These have been long, drawn out, unexpected wars. But the world isn't going to let us isolate. This isn't 47 or 77 or 97 because of what's going on out there. So I think we just have to be very smart and careful about how we come back. Secondly, and this goes to the sequestration and the readiness issue, typically after a war, our best young people, a lot of our best young people leave. You know, we have huge JO retention issues. We have huge mid-level E5, E6 retention issues. That hasn't happened, at least I haven't either read about it, and the contacts that I do have haven't spoken to me about that. So I worry about that, but I can tell you, you take a young JO that wants to fly a jet and you stick him out in that hangar and say, I don't have the money to maintain it, that young JO isn't sticking around very long, and I can do that for each service, officer enlisted sort of across the board. That's not what they came in for. I was at another conference, I mentioned the fiscal conference, the debt conference this morning. I think the Pentagon's got about the right amount of money. I think like it or not, and there are people that don't like it, you know, that article or that not survey, but the study that came out last fall, that $125 billion that you can get at systematically is there. It's $25 billion a year, and you can actually go get that, but that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of work from the leadership perspective. You can't just turn this over. Bob Gates at one point said, when the Obama administration came in, he says, oh, okay, I really want to get involved in the budget. I said, really? You want to do that? Because you're going to have a budget amendment in the spring after a new president comes in. I said, if you're going to do this, and when you have to do this, and you have to roll up your sleeves, and it's tough, arcane stuff for those of us that grew up in it. And so to do that, to get at the $25 billion a year, Jim Mattis is going to have to roll up his sleeve and say, this is what I'm going to do. And I think I had, when I was in 6 years, 2 as CNO, as a member of the Joint Chiefs, and 4 as chairman. I had 1 budget meeting in the White House, by the way. White House does policy. Now, budgets create policy options or take them away, but you want to know where budgets get put together? It's Mick Mulvaney. He's the guy that puts the budget together for the president and his predecessors in other administrations. So fixing that, and there's an agency in Washington that can't get leaner and be smarter about how they spend money, but leaders really have to focus on that. I think, I don't think we can reduce the budget a whole lot more. We're famous in this town, at the Pentagon, we're famous in this town for adding requirements, whether they are on programs, stuff that we're buying, or on places that we're operating. And we don't actively take anything or very much off the table. Leaders have to start saying, okay, I'll go do this, but what do you want me to stop doing that's okay? And then that gets into what we haven't had for decades, which is, what's our national strategy? What are we doing to foster prosperity and security in a changing world? And it is changing, and who's doing that? And you have a strategy, actually, an execution of what you're doing, but that's not any way to do it, because nobody knows how they fit in, except doing what they're told to do. And we're sorely lacking for that, and we have been for a long time.
Well, this links to something that you've spoken about before. I'm going to read a quote that you gave in The Atlantic in January, February 2015, which is sort of about how the American people sacrifice, if you will, with respect to use of military forces. So the quote is, the next time we go to war, the American people should have to say yes. And that would mean that 500,000 people who weren't planning to do this would have to be involved in some way. They would have to be inconvenienced. That would bring America in. America hasn't been in these previous wars, and we are paying dearly for that. So is this part of the civil-military issue that we're facing, where we have, if you will, this warrior caste that's engaged and maybe a set of decision makers in Washington, but is it your sense that the American people, either because of tax policy or the way in which the military is resourced in terms of personnel, is not largely feeling the effects of what the military is experiencing? Well,
I think, and it's a great question, and I meant what I said back then, and I'll say it a little more pointedly in just a second. to try to get at solving or potentially helping solve another problem. I was in the military in the 60s, sorry, and so I was there when we had a draft, and it was, and if I would compare the military I saw for those several years, 10 years or so, to where we are right now, there's just no comparison. It is the most, we have now the most exquisite, professional, exceptional force we've ever had. Actually, they give me hope for the future, the young people that I've served with in recent years. That said, it is drifting away slowly from the American people. The American people are not connected to this. It's the 1% piece, or less than 1%, as it turns out. We come from fewer and fewer places. We have, from a budget standpoint, bracked our way out of places all over the country. We almost don't exist in the Northeast anymore as a military. So we're not coaching Little League teams, we're not going to church, we're not in the schools. The American people don't know us except as we are depicted by the press, as it may or may not interest them. I've actually said for years, we almost are becoming our own version of the French Foreign Legion, which is go off, we'll pay you well, and the compensation package these days is much better than it was in the 90s, for those of you that have been around for a while. Congress and administrations from both the Democrat and Republican side have seen to that. We'll pay you very well, go off and fight our dirty little wars and let us get on with our lives. That's not America. That is a formula, quite frankly, for the undoing of us in the long term. And I believe strongly we need to fix that. I don't know what the fix is. I want to have, and one of the ways I describe it right now is, and this is not to get at the Pentagon budget issue, but it does. I don't want to have a big enough army, and this is what happens when you grow the budget like this, is all the services, what do? First of all, they're all hunkered down right now, you know, in their bunkers protecting their money, and they're trying to get other people's money, we call it, the other services money.
It's probably worth people knowing you used to do the money
yeah,
for
I used
the
to do that. I did. I grew up in money. I didn't grow up in policy until I was, I mean, more senior, but really policy full time.
So you know of what you
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was how I was trained. I mean, it was literally how I was trained. So you try to expand your resource base so you can buy more of, get bigger than whatever you are right now, generally speaking. Strategically, I think we need to have a big enough army, and I don't agree with Bob Gates on this, and I agree with Bob on most things, but Bob famously said at one point in time, an ex-president or a follow-on president or SecDef would be crazy to put 100,000 people somewhere in the future. And I get that. I understand why he said that, and it seems unlikely. But the empirical data is we've been 0 for 1,000 predicting where we'd go and what we'd need when we get there.
Which he
Since
also
1983, we have not predicted it. So I don't want to just take that off the table. We need to be able to have a force that can do that. And these wars, despite the fact that we'd like them to end quickly, they seemingly don't in this era. So we need to plan on a longer war than 3 months or 3 years, just based on the empirical data that we're living with right now. So I don't have I want to be able to put 100,000, whatever the right number is, somewhere. But if I have an army of 350,000 or so, and that's not the number, that's a number, I can put 100,000 somewhere. What I can't do is I can't sustain them. And so in order to do that, I'm going to have to call up 500,000 kids, and I'm going to have to draft them, temporarily draft them, you know, whatever the right answer is, so that I can sustain them. Now, I'm smart. I learned a lot about ground combat. I learned a lot about the Army. I learned a lot about the Guard and the Reserve, particularly on the Army side. And I recognize that I'm not going to be as ready as I'd like to be if I got to go draft 500,000 kids. And I'm going to have to use the Guard and Reserve. And there's a whole history there as well that I wish were a lot better than it was. But I'm going to have to call them up to sustain the bridge in order to relieve that 100,000 until I can get the 500,000 kids in, train them, and have them start the rotation if we're going to do this for a long period of time. Now, my Army buddies would kill me for this because they don't want to come down 100,000. They want to go up 100,000. And I just don't think, now that's That's an answer. I haven't figured out how to get the American people involved, but I guarantee you, if we made a decision nationally that we're going to call up 500,000 kids, now you're talking in every house with an eligible 18-year-old in the country. Now you're having the fulsome, wholesome, rigorous, raging debate you need to have, from my perspective, about going to war. It's that serious of a decision. And I don't want to say the American people have not been in this at all, because the American people have written the check, by the way, which has been, depending on who you believe, $3, $4, $5 trillion. That's all treasure that's coming out of, that we could be investing somewhere else. But it's that detachment which has come after a long, long time, and in developing this extraordinary force of young men and women that we have right now.
So I want to turn to, you talked a little bit about the current transition, and one of the features of the new administration, I think many would say, and we talked about quite a bit on the panels today, is the fact that there are a number of senior, recently retired military officers. You have one active duty senior military officer, General McMaster, serving as National Security Advisor, the third such active duty National Security Advisor. Should we have any concerns, and if so, what are they, and what will we do to ameliorate those concerns?
I talked about what I learned as chairman, and I would argue that anybody that's been in that chairman's job, save Colin Powell, had no experience going in, just like I did. You're sort of learning as you go. There isn't any training ground, because Colin had been the National Security Advisor as a three-star, active duty three-star, for Bush 41. He clearly did. Secretary Mattis, General McMaster, Secretary Kelly are all going through their own learning phase right now. Even though you've been around it, you've certainly been in discussions, but now you're sort of in the line of fire, if you will, on a regular basis. And I have tremendous confidence in those three individuals. I've known them all actually for a significant period of time. What I am a little bit anxious about is that we're not a country where we have staffed our civilian leadership with military leaders. I mean, we have historically, but it's been a long time. I mean, one of the things, Mattis goes through this confirmation process. There's a requirement to change the law. For waiver. Right. And the last one that served in that job, or that needed that waiver, was Secretary Marshall, was George Marshall. And my response to that, there's a reason that thing hasn't been used in, these many years. So it's a little bit concerning, and it is at the same time, when I talk to I talk to a lot of people around the country, the American people are really reassured right now by Mattis and Kelly and McMaster and Tillerson's presence with the administration. So I think it tugs, in that regard, it tugs both ways. For, again, another president that doesn't have a military background, obviously has faced, you don't have a lot of time to study all these things because they start coming at you. So in that regard, my druthers would be no, but that's not me. He is our president, and he can pick who he wants to, and they volunteered to go do this. And I got a lot of faith in them. That said, it's a straight up hill figuring out the politics, the political environment in which they are working as it relates to the national security issues.
I'm going to turn it over to the audience, but I have one quick follow-up, which is, now imagine you are one of your successors, General Joe Dunford, and you have a lot of former Marines, for one thing, but you have a Secretary of Defense who's a former 4-star, you have a 3-star at the White House. What is the particular role that the chairman needs to assert, if you will, or maintain in this environment that would be distinct from what people who have an experienced military background but are not vested with that chairman role? What is it that he should make sure he maintains for himself by these other former military representatives?
Well, I'd go back to almost to where I started, that independence, first of all. Secondly, not unlike my time, Dunford's there at a time where they're in transition. Mm-hmm. So he's been there a year and a half or so in the job, has his feet on the ground and is, pretty comfortable with all the issues. He's obviously got to establish relationships, with the new president and new administration. That said, he goes back with Secretary Mattis a long way. I actually am pretty comfortable that they can figure out, and John Kelly and HR, that they can figure out these relationships and that they understand where they are with respect to that. I'm not overly worried about, who SecDef is, and what SecDef does, and what you're supposed to do in support of SecDef and the president, and Joe will keep doing that. So I'm pretty comfortable with that.
Good. Okay, well, let's open this up to audience questions. I have one way in the back there. I think that's Kim, actually.
Admiral Mullen, Kim Dozier. You talked about how you thought that the two generals who spoke out at the two conventions shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
But my question is, we've got these people, these flag officers that we as Americans, American taxpayers, have put years of investment in. They have all this wisdom, all this experience. With the American public's lack of trust in the political system, I, as an American, would like to see more flag officers be able to take part. So do you want them to be political monks for the rest of their lives? Are we supposed to lose their experience?
I have no problem with, no, we're not. And I have no problem with quiet advice to whomever, both sides, quite frankly, because there is a ton of wisdom there. But I do have a problem, and it's my belief, perception and belief, that as they become political without being politicians, and there's a difference there, as they do that they undermine, that there is a bigger risk associated with undermining the institution from which they came. And part of the problem with what happened in Iraq, and it turns out it goes back further than that, but with what happened in Iraq and everybody speaking out on it, is we're training our young ones that this is okay. So when they get out, short of getting involved in politics, they can then start to speak out this way because people that they respect did that as well. So we're sending the wrong message to the American people, not the message itself, but the message that there's a former military leader that's sending it. And we're also training our young ones that this is okay as well. So I just think we can be more creative about having the same kind of impact without doing it as publicly as they've done it.
Okay, two questions about different aspects
Can you
of...
just identify yourself?
Sure. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services USA. I've also worked overseas in Central Asia and the Caucasus and some other interesting places. A question or two about the civilian part of the civilian-military relations. You talked about the distance of people serving in the military from the Northeast, okay? But certainly there are people in the Guard and the Reserve, so there would be interaction there, I should think. And also, with women in the military, how has that changed the view of civil society on the military and the role of women engaged in combat and in policy?
So and this is because, part of this is just budget for me. We have a BRAC every, 3-5 years, and we have it because we're 20% notionally, 20% over capacitized, that's the overhead. We go through BRAC, we're still 20% over. We're talking about another one right now. I'm willing to pay a certain price to exist in certain places in this country and pay the overhead to have the contact with the American people. And there are retireds living in the Northeast, retired men and women living all over the country, but it's not the same as being at a naval station or at an Army post with deploying, or at an Air Force base with deploying forces, living in the neighborhood, watching what people are going. I can tell you what I went through, but that's different from the reality of really what's going on right now. That's part of it. And we BRAC'd in it was I think it's the 05 BRAC, and I was involved in that. you're basically mainly focused on saving money on that. The other strategic thoughts in terms of the overall goals of a BRAC from my perspective, seem to get lost. Although I actually thought today, how do we solve this debt issue? How do we get them to actually do something? Maybe Congress could be heroic enough to create a BRAC-like process where they could somehow figure out how to, to have somebody go do this work, Simpson-Bowles-like, and say, boom, we're going to give it an up or down vote when they bring back to start to solve this huge debt problem. I first was involved with women in the Navy, women in the military, women in the Navy. Actually, my good old one of my mentors here, Jerry Holland, and I, and 6 other guys, I think, and 1 woman, tried to figure out how to bring women in the Naval Academy in 1976 when we got the order to do that. I've advocated for that literally since the 70s. I think it's made us a better force. It's certainly, we are more representative of the country, and I've seen women serve in combat in extraordinary ways, and that issue is obviously still out there. But we're a much better force for having women integrated into the military and go through the combat exclusion lift in 93, I think 93 or 94, and the very difficult discussions that we go through right now. From a combat standpoint, I have no problem with women in combat as far forward as we can put them if they can if they can meet the standards. That's where I am, and it's that can be very, very challenging, but I'm fully supportive of that. Just in my own world, I just found out I got better advice. I got a broader look at the world, if you will, if I had views from women rather than, just the guys, if you will. So I think that's it has become a reality. There'll still be challenges associated with that, and I heard a little of the last panel, the whole issue of sexual assault, which is a monstrous issue. It has been for a long time. And we need to solve, we the military, not me anymore, but military leadership, no kidding, need to solve this, or that authority, the discipline authority, is gonna be taken away. And I knew it was so bad. I actually got to a point a couple years ago where I was ready, and I'm pretty much of a chain of command guy, I was ready to let that go because we were so far from solving that problem. Now, I've gotten friends of mine that I told that were in active duty, they didn't want me to do that, so I stayed away from it. The statistics are somewhat better, but we need to figure out a way to solve that problem, and we still haven't solved it. And quite frankly, it's to get at the perps who are doing this. I offered a solution which drives a lot of people crazy, and there's no easy solution here, that if I were in charge, and I'm not in charge of anything, by the way, these days, but if I were in charge, I'd seriously consider moving the perp on accusation. And one of the things that would do is, if you started to do that, now you're affecting orders, now you're affecting careers, and clearly there would be allegations which would be untrue, and I understand it. But the problem has been so tough to get at that we need to do something different. Now, that moving somebody before they're proven guilty is that's a huge issue, and I understand all that. But the problem, the reason and I'm not sure that would do it either, but I was at altitude and airspeed with respect to what are we going to do about this, because the leaders were not handling it well.
Okay, other questions? I just want to make sure I'm not forgetting this side of the room, right over here. And then we'll go right next door to you. We can actually pair these. I'll give you 2 at once.
Yeah, Liam Collins with the Modern War Institute at West Point. Typically, we focus on the military's role with the executive branch in terms of civil relations, yeah, and we kind of overlook or don't get as much, and today was kind of similar to that, and what's the role with the legislative branch and keeping them informed in terms of civil relations, democratic accountability. So what challenge did you face with that in terms of keeping the legislative branch informed, you or the military in general? And what should that proper relationship be, recognizing, right, that once you go to the open hearings, that's inherently political, and the closed-door sessions, right, that's inherently about policy, but we can't always get necessarily what we want for that.
Okay, let's add, did you have a question? So, yep, let's add right there.
Midshipman Second Class Steber from the Naval Academy, sir.
I recognize the
Hoo-yah.
uniform.
My question has to do with marrying military resourcing and planning to legislative budgeting. And it seems in one of my classes we studied the recent budgetary report from the CBO as well as the CSR, and how the military, or the Navy in particular, has this 355 ship goal, but we've never actually reached any of our shipbuilding goals in the past, and it seems to be a political maneuver to try to just get some of the things we want. How do you get the military and the legislative branch to actually come up with a cohesive plan to meet the mission of fighting two-theater naval combat?
So when I'll try to reverse this just quickly, and there's a relationship there, obviously. So when I took over CNO, one of the things that we did for 6-9 months was look at how many ships we need. And I was a budget guy, so I've been in the shipbuilding account a long time, and I knew a lot about that. But it was a really rigorous study that looked at requirements, and we came up with a number, 313 ships. And we were, and where we were, which is where I felt my responsibility, we were at 260, but we were headed to 220 because we hadn't built the requirement piece. We hadn't obviously funded it like we should. And unless you have a legitimate, believable requirement, and then you advocate for that, it's too easy to undercut. And actually that number 313 stayed out there for a significant period of time. John Greenert, who was the last CNO, revised that, I think, to 315 through the same kind of thing. And John Richardson, who's a CNO now, has looked at what his requirements are, and he just didn't pull that number out. It's a pretty rigorously done analysis to say this is our number. One of the questions is, for a president or anybody else, is do you want to meet that requirement? And here's what it's going to take. It's made particularly difficult right now. They're always difficult, but it's made particularly difficult because we have to renew the strategic submarine force, which basically takes up, if you do that, if you pay for that, that takes up half, that alone takes up half the shipbuilding account. So we have a responsibility in the military and in the Pentagon to lay out what our requirements are. And then you go to the Hill and you start to fight for those requirements. And despite, and I should know the answer to this, despite all the press, the Hill basically, the hearings and the final changes, and maybe you know this, Kath, I think in the end Congress plays with maybe 5% of the budget max. I mean, what is it? Yeah, it's like, so it's a very small number, although it gets a lot of hoorah, if you will, throughout the process. And I'm not saying that's bad, it's just where it is. And I may be strange. When I first came to town, and I came late, I came as an 06 and really started engaging the Hill as an 07, but there's a wonderful guy who was a vice chief named Don Pilling, who was a budget guy. I mean, he was as good a budget guy as military's ever had. And one of the things he said to me was, one of the things you don't want to do here is tick off your banker. You don't want to do that personally. You don't want to do it professionally. We don't want to do it here. And the message was, go see your banker and establish a relationship. And I did that. That was 95, 96. And I did that over the course of, the next 10 years. It wasn't just the politicians that elected representatives, because key to that is also staffs, chiefs of staff for key players, staff directors, because they set the table for those politicians. And as an extension of that, I may be the only one I know, but I didn't mind going to hearings. That was a great opportunity to make my case, whatever it is. Now I learned early, painfully, this is their show, not mine. So they're the stars. I don't want to be the star, but it is an opportunity to address key issues. Just like they're human, like anybody, you try not to surprise them. So if something bad happens or something different happens, you get on the phone to them or to their staff and say, hey, this is coming, you're going to see this. And you need them. You need authorizers, but you also, in the money world, you also need appropriators. And so relationships with all of those are absolutely critical. And then so I found, and it was a long time. I had no idea that I was going to be the chairman. But I will tell you that 9 years of work through the time that I was CNO, and I had some really terrific relationships, that really paid off. You know, this is '07, so height of the surge when I take over, and I've got good relationships on both sides of the aisle on what is generally regarded as a relatively bipartisan set of committees in both the Senate and the House on the appropriation side as well as authorizers. So you have to work that very, very hard. That to me is a little different. And if you're showing up as the chief of the army and you've never done that, then that's like being the chairman and you got a new president. You're trying to figure all this stuff out. The services, generally speaking, don't do that. You know how all that sausage gets made. What you don't know with a new administration, different from that relationship, is that's right now, they're moving fast, and you're going to be involved. And so establishing that relationship has to happen much more quickly. I was fortunate. I was in a position where I had good, long-standing relationships on the Hill when I took over as chairman and as CNO. And I would argue that's the way to approach this. And they're good people. They want to do well. They've got their own politics. But quite frankly, in the defense world, I see them much more likely to lay their politics down. They wouldn't want to call that way and do what's right there in the defense world than I've seen in other places.
Okay, one last question because we are at time. I'll go right here, and that's it.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Michelle Munger, and my question has to do with the book Tribe by Sebastian Junger. I was really moved by
I'm sorry, it's to do with what?
Tribe, to do with
The book Tribe
veterans.
by Sebastian Junger.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. My question is really, do you agree with his thesis that the veterans coming back into civil society are not understood because of the tribal relationships that they make? And if so, are there any solutions that would work?
Great question. I worry a little bit that we characterize veterans based on the few stories that we see where it's really not gone well. And that 95% of them transitioning back into civilian life is hard. It's made harder in particular if you've been at war and in ground combat and seen what Sebastian and others have seen, if you will. So that doesn't mean we don't need to pay attention to that. The tribe piece is a powerful, powerful word. The first time actually I ever heard tribe was John Jumper, who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force and a good friend of mine, who started to talk about his tribe. And it really sort of started to click in that, we have four services that are tribes. We have tribes in the services. But more powerfully, the tribal way of life is something that we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, in the Middle East, and in other parts of the world. But when you're at war, we were learning as we go with respect to that. So it is a powerful, powerful factor in our lives, more so than we know. And certainly we need to understand that as these veterans come back and make transition. I spend a fair amount of time on this issue in the veteran space now. And the biggest challenge any veteran has is transition. It's not a priority for us on the active duty side. My investment in you, if you're a sailor or a soldier, airman, Marine, or Coast Guardsman, my investment in you for your future is the 4 years or the 8 years you're here. I don't pay any attention to my transition programs. If you talk to young people, actually young and older that go through transition in the services, they would tell you outside the legal documents or whatever they had to sign, pretty much didn't do anything. It's not a priority for us. Our culture is active duty. It's while you're here, we love you. When you're gone, I got a day job, it's a big day job, we know you're gonna be okay. That's not always the case. I don't like that model. It's been that way for 150 years or so. We need to change that. It's my belief that when a young person in America signs up to serve their country, we need to have them from cradle to grave, quite frankly. And that may need a lot of support, or they may need no support, or something in between. But that we have mechanisms that join the Pentagon, the VA, communities throughout the country to make sure that those who've served are very well supported, whatever that requirement. And I'll leave you with what I consider to be prima facie validation of that issue. We're an active duty culture. My wife and I, sitting at Fort Bragg 2010 or 11 with about a dozen Gold Star spouses. And I think about 10 of them wanted to stay connected to the Army. Young 20-year-olds with kids, paid the ultimate sacrifice, have gone through obviously a nightmare that none of us would ever want to go through. And because that vein that connected them was now cut off, basically, and this wasn't an active conscious decision, but because of who we are, and he, in this case, he is no longer here anymore, boom, please have a nice life. Thank you for your sacrifice. That was a terrible and yet very important moment for me. But we do it in many other ways as well.
Well, before I go on to thank you, which I will do momentarily, I just want to comment to let you know there's a lot more on our website. If you've made it this far, you care a lot about civil-military relations, but we have more. On the conference website, Alice Friend has done a podcast series with a variety of thought leaders on civil-military relations who we were not able to feature on stage today. That includes Mac Owens, Aaron Simpson, Michael Desch, Mary Beth Ulrich, and Richard Cohn. And you can also tune into those via our website, or you can go to SoundCloud and search for Command Climate. I don't know how to do that, but hopefully it is as direct as that sounds.
SoundCloud.
SoundCloud.
I just want to say thanks. This is a hugely important issue. We don't spend enough time on it. We really don't spend enough time on it. It becomes incidental or anecdotal or situational in a crisis. And we need to do a whole lot better job teaching our young men and women, teaching those who are involved in this a lot more about it. And that's one of the reasons I like Peter and Elliot and others that are really focused on this. So this is a great series, and I'm delighted that you're doing this.
Great, thanks very much. And
Yeah.
please join me in a round of applause for Admiral and all today's speakers.